If I were to use some of the same language and wording that TV licensing uses in its letters that it sends out in my letters, then I might get into some serious trouble as a lawyer. Unless I at least intended to follow through on some of the threats legally on behalf of my clients, or the language within it was accurate. And there's some particular wording that I do have issue with, and that is enforcement. Because enforcement has a very particular meaning when it comes to anything legal. Enforcement generally means that they can take some tangible action against you to enforce something. Now, on the surface, they could argue that they are enforcing the law and the rules for TV licensing to ensure that you have the correct license, which may be no license at all, by the way, because if you don't watch or record live TV and you don't download BBC programs on BBC iPlayer, you don't need a license. So you will be correctly licensed if you don't do any of those things and don't have a license. But other than that, the enforcement, the use of the words enforcement, I take issue with. Now, rolling things back, some of you have sent me dozens of letters and you've been hounded for many, many years. Some of you having told TV licensing already that you don't need a TV license, and yet still the letters come. Now, there was a case that I discussed in a previous video, which is Worthington and Another against the Metropolitan Housing Trust, where the judge ruled that there was a valid claim for harassment, in that the Housing Trust made all sorts of threats of litigation that didn't really exist. For example, they said that the litigation process was underway, and it wasn't. So that was just not correct. And so when I talk about some of these TV licensing letters, some of the letters and some of the, at least the very track record of these letters over a period of time, could indeed amount to harassment, because if they haven't followed through on any of those threats, then they were empty threats. And if they say that an enforcement visit was scheduled and no visit takes place, then was it ever arranged in the first place? Now, they might have a record that backs up that somebody was due to visit, but if they don't visit and they do that again and again and again, then again that could amount to harassment. Now, one viewer, one of you guys, have sent me hundreds of pages, literally hundreds of pages, over a 6-year period that I've been looking at so far. Now, right from the beginning, it said, this address is now unlicensed. We need you to get in touch. We need you to buy a license or tell us you don't need a license, and so on. And many of these letters say that you've left us no choice but to open an investigation. And this is going back some 6 years or so to 2017 and 18. So the mere fact that an investigation has ostensibly been going on for that long, they should really have taken some tangible action. Now, some of these letters are quite concerning. For example, some of them are headed, "Please get in touch to avoid further action." Well, what action? Because other than visiting the address without a warrant, there is no further action. There is nothing else that they can do. Now, I'm not being rude to TV licensing here, but the law does not allow them to do anything else unless they have a warrant. So they can visit the property, but if they are asked politely to leave, they need to leave. There's nothing else that they can do. They can't walk around to the back garden looking through windows and things like that. They just can't do those things. That would be trespassing, and so they shouldn't be doing that. But also, the word enforcement comes up again and again, and this, again, I take issue with. Now, some of these letters that then move on to discuss enforcement, one of which said, "You're a dear legal occupier, an IN0100A11 code has been issued against your address." Now, that doesn't mean anything to me, and I'm fairly sure it doesn't mean anything to you. And quite honestly, I don't think it means anything to anybody else watching this video. What does it mean? What is an IN0100A11? What is this code? I don't think anyone really knows what this code means, but it says here, we use it to target unlicensed homes like yours that require a visit from, and here's the bit that I take issue with, TV licensing enforcement officers. And then in a separate letter says, your address has been scheduled for a visit by an enforcement officer from the enforcement division. But as I said earlier, enforcement has a very specific meaning in law. And even in the Communications Act 2003, which houses the law for the requirement for a TV license, in Part 4, Section 363, the license required for the use of TV receivers. 364 is the licenses, 365 is the license fees, and 366 is the power to enforce TV licensing. But when we look into that section, it refers predominantly to a Justice of the Peace or a Sheriff in Scotland or a lay magistrate in Northern Ireland being satisfied of information on oath that an offence is being committed or that the evidence of the commission of the offence is likely to be on the premises specified in the information, or that one or more of the conditions set out in Section 3 is satisfied. And all of this, of course, referring to an application for a warrant to visit the address, which is accompanied by an information on oath that there's likely an offence being committed or that evidence of the commission of the offence is likely to be on the premises specified, and that one or more of the conditions are satisfied. And that is usually that there's no person entitled to grant entry with whom it's practicable to communicate, and so on. So in other words, if no one's going to talk to them, and the information accompanying the application for the warrant sets out why there might be an offence being committed and evidence of the offence and so on, all of this enforcement is really to do with the warrant to visit the address. And then the rest of the section sets out the requirements of they're not to, for example, they're not to enter the premises or a vehicle any time more than 1 month after the day on which the warrant was granted, and so on, and various other requirements. But the point of all this being is that the word enforcement is really to do with warrants and not just a casual visit to your address. So when these letters say, your address has been scheduled for a visit by an enforcement officer, it reads as though they have a warrant, because that's what enforcement means under the Communications Act 2003. And in any other sense for a civil matter or a criminal matter, an enforcement usually means that there is a judgment, there is an order, there is a finding. So there's a judgment against an individual, or there's some kind of conviction against an individual. So enforcement proceedings might be to enforce an order that's already been made by the court, or a finding that's already been made by the court, not just a visit. So these letters suggest, on the face of it, that there is some warrant already issued for the address, but that, I understand, at least insofar as these letters are concerned, the recipient of which, who shall remain anonymous as it's their right to do so, says that no visit with a warrant or anything else has ever happened. But this particular one was about 4 years ago. So if this letter says that the address has been scheduled for a visit by an enforcement officer, two things could happen there potentially. Firstly, there could be a question raised as to whether there really was a scheduled visit from an enforcement officer at all, because no one ever turned up. And so if it wasn't really scheduled, then this letter might amount to harassment, because it's a threat of something happening when it didn't happen and may never have been scheduled to happen, despite what the letter says. The second thing is, it says it's a scheduled visit by an enforcement officer. Well, what are they there to enforce? Are they there to enforce the law? Because they're not police officers. And if they don't have a warrant, then it doesn't come under the power to enforce TV licensing under 366, because they don't have a warrant. And if they did have a warrant, I suspect they would have turned up with the warrant, because why else would they obtain a warrant if they never intended to go through with it? So my guess is that this was not a visit by an enforcement officer with a warrant. My guess is that it was just an employee that was ostensibly scheduled to visit the address, even though they never turned up. So this letter saying that they've been scheduled for a visit by an enforcement officer is, in my view, most likely to be misleading, because no one ever turned up, much less with a warrant. So there's possibly dozens or hundreds or even thousands of you that have received dozens or hundreds of these letters over several years, like this viewer that sent me these hundreds of pages received over many years, which could potentially amount to harassment if a court were to rule that all of these letters received one after another, month after month, year after year, threatening visits from enforcement officers and all these sorts of things. If somebody were driven to despair with the constant threat of prosecution by these letters, that might well amount to harassment. And ultimately, it only really needs one person, one case, to bring a claim against TV licensing for harassment with a whole batch of these letters, such as these ones here. A properly pleaded case in harassment might ultimately succeed, just as it did in the case of Worthington and another against Metropolitan Housing Trust, because they had a claim in harassment because the trust was using solicitors to send letters making threats about litigation, which wasn't really going on. And so if these letters threatening enforcement officers, which on the face of it might lead you to believe that they have a warrant when they don't, or they may not, you might feel that that amounts to harassment. Of course, this video is not legal advice. It cannot be taken as such, but I find it an interesting situation that we might be on the cusp here of another ultimate scandal like the post office. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you've got a stack of these letters, I'd be interested to see them. My PO box address, Royal Mail only, is on our website and it's in the description of most of my videos. Do check it out. Send the letters to me. I'd be interested to read them. And ultimately, this might blow up into a huge story. So if you found that interesting, please do like the video. Please do make sure you subscribe. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.